If you're a millennial, or at least grew up in one of several age brackets that were caught up in the Harry Potter craze, then there's a good chance that you spent a decent bit of time daydreaming about getting sent off to a magic school. Imagining how cool it would be to learn spells alongside your friends, get sorted into a house whose lineage dates back hundreds of years, and face off with dark wizards in epic duels. It's only natural. The mythology of that universe was uniquely suited to capture the minds of teenagers and young adults. Across 7 books and even more films, the Harry Potter franchise transformed the concept of a boarding school for wizards into the dominant power fantasy of the 21st century. But power fantasies are destined to be deconstructed. Just as Watchmen found the skeletons superheroes hide behind the capes and cowls in their closet, it was inevitable that someone would come along and dig up the bodies buried in the basements of those arcane academies. And that is exactly what BioWare did with the Mage origin of Dragon Age Origins. In the Mage origin, BioWare presents a grimdark version of a magic school, where everything that would typically be treated as a positive or simply part of the fun, like leaving home to study spells, living alongside other mages, and learning to control your vast powers, are instead transformed into rituals of control, enacted not out of a desire to create a unique arcane culture, but out of fear or necessity, depending on your point of view. In doing so, BioWare not only subverts the greatest power fantasy of modern times, it provides players with a front row seat to the most complicated moral quandary facing the world of Thedas. It's Hogwarts, but it sucks. But before I go on, if you are a Dragon Age fan, then please be sure to like, subscribe, and consider supporting me with a YouTube channel membership or over on Patreon. My dream is to make these videos full-time someday, and by doing any of those things, you'll be helping make that dream a reality. The Mage origin kicks off with what is probably Duncan's bleakest introduction of the bunch. Most of his opening monologues briefly summarize the grim history of your species or caste. But here, Duncan makes it clear that you, personally, have been shafted by life on Thedas. Your magical abilities weren't hailed as a gift. You were hauled off to the Circle Tower against your will, where your tutelage has focused less on using your abilities and more on controlling them. And if you fail to control those abilities, then the jailers/Templars looking over your shoulder will kill you without a second thought. At least the Jedi, contemporaries in the child-stealing tradition, teach their pupils resistance to the dark side through restraint, through mastery of their better impulses, and the light side of the Force. The Circle of Magi teaches resistance through brutal, Darwinian example, by demonstrating the many dangerous things that will happen to you if you fail to do so. From demonic possession to tranquility, most roads lead to ruin for the mages of the Dragon Age world. All of that kicks off with the opening quest, which is also noteworthy in terms of the design of this particular origin. Most origins start slowly, with an opportunity for the player to meet the major characters in their protagonist's life, before diving into a true task or challenge. Even the Dalish elf origin, which begins in the middle of a mission, makes sure you know Tamlin before you go off to hunt Darkspawn. But in the Mage origin, you're woken up in the middle of the night and thrown into the Fade to make sure you've read How Not to Become an Abomination for Dummies cover to cover. It's such a brilliant deconstruction of the magic school power fantasy. There's no sorting hat, no nearly headless ghost, no house cup to pass the time. Just a secret rite of passage no one told you about for fear it might make you overly prepared for the dangers ahead. Again, at the Circle Tower, you're not taught how to best use your powers so much as you're told over and over again that you better not screw up, and the harrowing is the final exam in the Don't Let In a Demon Olympics. Even First Enchanter Irving, the closest thing we have to a Dumbledore, doesn't mince words here. There's no esoteric advice or riddle in his words. He gets real with you. You just have to get through it, like every other mage that's gone before you. The trip into the Fade that follows is particularly interesting when you consider what Dragon Age Inquisition revealed about this mysterious realm. I doubt everything in the Dragon Age franchise was perfectly planned out. Nothing ever is. But even here, in its debut appearance, you can see the traces of what we now know about the Fade. It's a place of balance, where demons and spirits coexist, their nature determined by the perceptions, expectations, and experiences of those who enter it. The demons of this region of the Fade, Pride and Sloth, are here because they're directly tied to two of the greatest fears mages have during the harrowing, taking too long or failing in general, and they've both likely grown in strength thanks to the litany of young mages who have been thrown to them over the years. The same is true of Valor as well, who's probably helped a fair few students find their way to victory and return to the real world. But of the three spirits/demons, the most interesting one, in terms of franchise relevance, might be Sloth, who clearly demonstrates the dual nature of these entities as described by Solus. Sure, he's out to devour you, but if handled the right way, he'll grant Mouse a bear form that'll help you out quite a bit later on. Mouse's shtick is easy to see through, at least as an adult, but when I first played this game when I was 18, I bought this guy's bullshit hook, line, and sinker, which is probably the point, given that our mage is supposed to be roughly that age at the time of their harrowing. If I were a naive mage who just wanted to get around to living out my magic school power fantasy, this is exactly the type of routine I'd buy into. This guy would be like CM Punk to me, the voice of the voiceless. You tell him, Mouse, we gotta stick it to the man. We gotta get back at those evil Templars for what they did to you. All of this is made more effective when you factor in that the player has not yet seen just how dangerous magic can be if left unchecked, something they won't see, in truth, until they return to the Circle Tower later in the game. With various forms of help from Valor, Sloth, and Mouse, our mage will do battle with a rage demon, only to discover that the true test was whether or not they could see through the deception of Mouse, who the rage demon says lured you here as part of a deal. After some questioning, Mouse will reveal his true identity, a pride demon, and though it's never explicitly said, I've always assumed this to be the same one that possesses Uldred later in the game. BioWare could have easily stretched the segment in the Fade enough to make it most, if not the entirety, of the origin. But understanding the dangers presented by your powers is only half of knowing what it means to be a mage in the Dragon Age world. The other is understanding the dangers presented to you by the wicked hearts and wicked eyes of the outside world. Once you've told off Mouse and seen his true form, you've completed your harrowing. And for all of that hard work, all that stress and anxiety, you're not given the slightest reward. You just wake up in your quarters. There's no Triwizard Cup, no brand new broomstick, no wand from Ali Ali Oxenfreeze, just proof of life. A clear demonstration that for mages in this universe, survival is the only gift they'll ever receive. In place of fanfare, you're awarded with an uglier looking set of robes than the one you went to bed in, and are introduced to Jaan. Jaan is, to put it mildly, probably the most unlikable non-villain in any of the Origins. This isn't a criticism, however. He's clearly intended to come off this way. He's a wonderfully written, inept, incompetent mess. Like an annoying little brother, he wants to know everything about the harrowing so he can better prepare himself for it. But it's not out of some scholarly interest or competitive desire to do better than you. He makes it perfectly clear that he's nervous as hell. And as much of a jabroni as he is, I have to admit that I did feel bad for him at this point in the story. If you knew that a test as important and deadly as the harrowing was around the corner, wouldn't you try to find some type of advantage that would help you fare better? Some type of edge that might ensure your survival? But unfortunately for Jaan, preparing for the harrowing isn't his biggest concern. It's why they haven't taken him for it yet, in the first place. He's been here longer than you have, and as we'll soon learn, he has good reason to be afraid. From there, the player is told to follow up with Irving, but there's no need to rush to his office. With the Circle Tower unlocked to us, it's a good idea to explore every floor and talk to the various NPCs, all of whom help bring this dark fantasy rendition of Hogwarts to life. Instead of houses divided by personality traits, the mages of Dragon Age have the fraternities of enchanters, political factions that debate the proper treatment of mages, and wear incredibly stupid hats. Goofy ghosts and lovable oafs like Hagrid have been replaced by the Tranquil, people who used to be mages just like you, until they willingly or unwillingly received an arcane lobotomy that cut off all use of their powers and rendered them emotionless, thereby ensuring they won't be possessed by a demon. Upon meeting with Irving, our mage gets another look at his working relationship with Knight Commander Gregor. Their rapport is so well done. They argue like an old married couple. You can tell that in another life, under different circumstances, they'd probably have been really good friends. But instead, they've been forced onto opposite sides of a debate that has no right answers. Gregor knows how bad things can get if mages are allowed to operate unchecked, while Irving is just trying to keep the Templars honest and let his students live their lives. It's here that we also meet Duncan, who Irving has us escort back to his room. As I said in my previous video, his dialogue about his order is just about the same in every origin, but what's unique about Duncan in this setting is his approach to the mages. He knows how powerful mages can be, but that doesn't scare him, not one bit. Rather, he wants to harness it against the Darkspawn, and will openly tell you that he is not opposed to blood magic if it can be used to stop the Blight. Throughout so much of this origin, we're given opinions on the mage debate from people on one side or the other, mages or Templars. But here's a take from someone out in the real world, who's willing to acknowledge the value in even the most taboo forms of magic. Which is important, because we're right around the corner from a front row seat with the forbidden. After finishing with Duncan, Jaan's back on his bullshit, and he wants to meet with our mage. He introduces us to Lily, proving that the mysterious initiate he's been telling us about is real, not like that Canadian girlfriend your buddy had in 4th grade. It's here that Jaan unveils a plan that would make Hannibal from A-Team lose his shit. He's learned that he's not yet been brought in for his harrowing because for him, there will be no harrowing. He's suspected of being a blood mage, and thus, Irving and Gregor have decided to make him tranquil without ever giving him the survive or die entrance exam. To circumvent this, he intends to break into the repository, steal his phylactery, a vial of blood that can be used to trace his location, and flee the Circle Tower so he can go off and make wonderful apostate babies with Lily. All joking aside, before we get into his plan, this is a disturbing revelation. We have no idea if Jaan really is a blood mage yet, but the fact that it sounds like this practice in general is rather commonplace just highlights the dire straits mages are in. At this point, it's easy to believe that Jaan is being targeted for tranquility because he's incompetent, which isn't a crime, and if Irving and Gregor can justify doing this to someone who's failed to live up to expectations, then just about everyone is at risk. Again, we haven't yet seen the other side of this debate, the dangers of magic unrestrained, but the policy itself is indefensible, which makes it easy to sympathize with someone as foolish as Jaan. And foolish he is! His plan fails to account for an escape route. Even if the three of you do get into the repository and out, how the hell are you supposed to flee the Circle Tower, which is teeming with Templars? Does he really think they're just going to let you walk out the front door? And then how are you supposed to get across the lake? Does he think they're just going to give you a boat? I suppose you could make the case that he always planned on doing what he ends up doing at the end of the quest, but that would assume far too much competence on Jaan's part. I really think he just didn't account for this incredibly important detail. Regardless of the plan's merits, this type of plotline is yet another key aspect of the Magic School power fantasy. The first 3 Harry Potter novels feature a climax where Harry, Ron, and Hermione have to go behind their teacher's back to do something of great importance. But in those novels, it's always something of world-altering proportions. Here, it's all about brutal Darwinian survival. Again, brilliant deconstruction on the part of BioWare. From there, the story beats are just about what you'd expect. Using their newfound freedoms, the player must acquire a string of items Lily and Jaan wouldn't be able to get on their own. Along the way, you slay some spiders and lie to your teachers, both hallmark Magic School tropes. But even here, there's a twist. Rather than blindly follow the lovebirds' ill-fated plan, the player can report it to Irving. This is fundamentally against the greater themes of most Magic School media, where camaraderie and friendship are positioned above following the rules. But here, it's handled differently. Perhaps it's the innate survivalist instinct that comes along with being a mage, or the stupidity of Jaan's plot. But it doesn't feel like you're tattling to the teacher. It comes off more like an act of self-preservation or professional dedication on behalf of all mages who aren't as boneheaded as Jaan. Irving is shocked, but not surprised by the news. He knew of Jaan and Lily's relationship, but he didn't think they'd have the audacity to try and escape. He then asked the player to follow through with the plot on his behalf, luring the two of them into a trap. It's a really intriguing request that shines a light on the shrewdness of his character. The first enchanter is no Dumbledore, but he sure is good at 4D chess, and as he puts it, if he's going to have to sacrifice one of his students, then Gregor should have to do the same. It's a bit cold, perhaps even vindictive, but there's no doubt that this type of mindset not only helped Irving survive his own harrowing, but allowed him to become the most powerful mage in the Circle Tower. He also makes a strong point here about Lily's involvement in all of this. It's easy to feel bad for her. She has a genuine interest in helping the man she loves. But the finer points of this plan were all developed by her. Critically, it's during this conversation that Irving confirms that Jaan is indeed practicing blood magic, and he even has eyewitness testimony to prove it. Though Jaan's earlier denials were far from convincing, they were easy to believe because of his incompetence. For me, this information has always made me inclined to take Irving's path, because even if my mage is of the belief that all forms of magic have their uses, there is no way in hell that Jaan, of all people, should be using blood magic. It's like taking a toddler to the spin art table. It's going to be a mess, and you're going to regret it. Is the Circle Tower a glorified prison? Of course it is. Is blood magic inherently dangerous? Perhaps. But should this guy be allowed to leave the tower and practice it as much as he'd like? Absolutely not. But to each their own. As I said in my previous video, I'm not here to tell you how to roleplay. Before I move on, there are 2 other parts of this conversation that I'd like to point out. First, Irving does admit that if it were up to him, things might be different. I've seen some folks online interpret this to mean that Irving might be open to allowing mages to study blood magic if it weren't for the presence of the Templars. But I don't think that's the case. I think he just means that, in his view, using blood magic deserves a lesser form of punishment, not something permanent and life-altering like tranquility. But again, that's just my take on what he says here. And as much as I've ripped Jaan's jabroni-brained plan, I have to say that Irving's trap is pretty foolish in its own right. You might not know the power of blood magic at this point in the story, but Irving certainly does, and yet he's totally down to let one break into the repository and destroy his phylactery. I understand that he's playing politics and that he doesn't want Lily to go without a consequence, but he's taking a huge risk by going down this route at all. His plan ultimately relies on Jaan's incompetence, and as we'll soon see, underestimating him proves to be a costly mistake. Once you're ready to enact Jaan's plan, the magic school tropes pop right up again. There are puzzles to solve, a magic door to get through, sentries to fight, and a talking statue who will later hint at the future of the franchise. Once you're out of the repository, it's time to get around to that glaring flaw I mentioned earlier, the escape. Just as expected, Jaan's lack of a plan here proves to be his undoing, as Irving and Gregor show up with an entourage of Templars. Gregor declares that the three of you are under arrest, but Irving will bail you out if you've been working for him. Baffled by this turn of events, Jaan resorts to the only edge he has, his blood magic, revealing that the rumors are true. Though he incapacitates the Templars and Irving, Lily rejects Jaan, horrified that he turned to such a vile practice. He tries to weasel his way back into her good graces, but it's to no avail, and with no other recourse, he flees the tower to live alone as an apostate. It's not the smoothest sequence, but it is effective in that it shows, albeit briefly, the dangers of unrestricted magic. If forbidden and uncontrolled magic can allow someone as incompetent as Jaan to take out a squad of Templars and the first enchanter and then escape from the Circle Tower, imagine what it could do in the hands of someone who's truly powerful. It's on this note that the origin ends, as Duncan recruits you, either to get you away from the ire of Irving and Gregor if you didn't sell out Jaan, or reward you for your dedication to the Circle if you did. Looking at the origin as a whole, I think it's brilliant that BioWare decided to funnel so much of this magic school deconstruction through Jaan. His cause, escaping from the clearly terrible mage prison you've all been trapped in, is inherently admirable, a purpose that is furthered by the fact that up to this point we've seen few true examples of the dangers of unrestricted magic. As such, it creates a dynamic where the conditions you've been living under as a mage are so cruel that it makes resistance and escape a necessity, but where Jaan is so foolish and his plan is so flawed that these are obviously the worst possible circumstances in which to attempt a jailbreak. It makes either path, Irving's or Jaan's, wholly justifiable. I put Jaan through the ringer in this video, so in the interest of fairness, I do have to give him credit for the fact that he does manage to escape, but only because of blood magic, which was not a part of his plan, and cost him the person he was doing all of this for in the first place, Lily. We're never told how he escaped the rest of the Circle Tower and got off the island, so it's safe to assume that he just kept pressing B for blood magic all the way to freedom. In terms of callbacks later in the game, the Mage origin has quite a few. The Mage is one of 4 origins who get to return home later in the game, and when they do, the Circle Tower is in worse shape than practically anywhere else you go in the game aside from Denerim in the final act. It's here that the deconstruction of the magic school power fantasy reaches its apex, its natural conclusion, when the bodies buried in the basement are brought out for all to see. The origin doesn't present a unique villain. Uldred doesn't count. He's largely faceless unless you're really paying attention, but Jaan does come back later in the game, during the events at Redcliffe Castle, where he's at the center of another absolute mess, having poisoned Arl Eamon on behalf of Loghain. The reappearance is a nice connection, and his presence, carelessly at the heart of disaster, is just so in character, and I love how running into him feels like bumping into that kid who used to copy your homework back in high school at a college party, and then suddenly realizing that you know exactly who kicked over the keg and puked in the flower pot earlier that evening. I do think it's a shame, however, that Lily doesn't reappear during the main campaign. As I said earlier, I do think she deserves some blame here. The finer points of this plan were developed by her, but her motivations were admirable. She's helping Jaan out of love, and she had no idea that he was a blood mage. I think it's a bit unfair for her story to end with her going to Aenar. I'd love to have seen her pop up in a side quest, maybe in one of the small missions that come up when the player is traveling between regions. Perhaps the Templars who were escorting her to Aenar were attacked by Darkspawn, allowing her to escape, at which point she decided to help refugees fleeing the Blight, sort of like Jaan does, in an unfortunately broken questline that would have taken place had you allowed him to survive the events at Redcliffe Castle. But probably the strongest aspect of the mage origin is the way it feeds into the larger debate about the rights of mages as a whole. Out of all of the origins, the mage background is, inarguably, the one with the greatest relevance on the last two Dragon Age games. Dragon Age 2 makes the mage question its central debate, and Inquisition follows up on this before passing the baton to the elves in the second half of the game. Thus, by playing the mage origin, you're given a front row seat to this moral quandary, and get to see firsthand just how terribly mages are treated out of fear. You could make the case that the aforementioned quest at the Circle Tower does this as well, but the mage origin provides the events of that storyline with such a humanizing element that without having played this background, it's simply not the same. Deciding whether to free or annul the Circle feels a lot different when you know the faces and the names of the people at risk. Though the manner in which the debate over mage rights takes the reins in Dragon Age 2 feels a bit sudden, perhaps even somewhat forced, I must admit that it's a compelling question. If you've watched my video on the Bloody Baron, then you know how much I enjoy effectively told morally gray decisions in games, and this is honestly another great example of this. I often see the arguments about mage rights and Thedas get reduced to extremes, the belief that they should be free without restrictions, or that the circles don't go far enough in policing magic users. But all three Dragon Age games present the downsides of both approaches honestly and authentically, to the point where I don't think the debate can be reduced to a simple binary. It is a far more nuanced question than this. A scale that slides between liberty and prison can't be the only option here. Playing the mage origin, even if you don't complete the game as the character, helps establish an opinion on this matter, while also grounding it in lived experience. You know what mages go through in Thedas because you've seen it firsthand. You know how repressed they are, and yet how dangerous blood magic can be, which puts you in a unique position to make a decision about what should be done with the Circle of Magi in the later games. Personally, this origin made me really empathize with the mage cause, to the point where I've always wanted to see them freed. But I still believe there need to be some guardrails in place. Maybe a mage charter or a code of conduct that encourages them to keep each other honest. Fortunately, Inquisition does allow for a more nuanced approach to this topic, as their choice of a divine leads to three very different outcomes for the Circle of Magi. Another thing propping up the long-term relevance of the origin is the fact that if you choose to be a human mage, you'll be a part of the Amel family, making you the cousin of Hawke, the protagonist of Dragon Age 2. It's only referenced a few times, but it's a neat little connection between the games, and personally, I like the idea of this one little family of mages from Ferelden dominating the major events of Thedas across the first two games. I'd also argue that the mage has unique flexibility from a role-playing perspective. Compared to all the other origins, they're very much a blank slate. Even if we know they're an Amel, we know little about what their upbringing was like, what friends they might have had at the Circle Tower aside from Jaan, or what they did for fun when they weren't studying magic. The other origins aren't nearly as malleable in this regard, especially the two noble origins, where there are only so many things your character could have been doing before the events of the game. This, in turn, really makes so many of the choices and dialogue responses in the game feel like things your character might do. A sarcastic mage, for example, just seems to be a bit more natural than it would be for the nobles, or especially the city elf, who's lived an incredibly shitty life. These are the many things that make the mage background unique among the origins, and in my opinion, possibly the strongest in the game's catalog. It begins as a deconstruction of the magic school power fantasy, a fascinating and timely artistic statement, before serving as a staging ground for debate about the rights of magic users that takes center stage in Dragon Age 2 and Inquisition. But while the relevance of this origin is rather high, there is another that I feel is quite strong, despite the fact that it has little impact on the franchise today. So I hope you'll join me next time as we take a deep dive into the Dwarven Noble origin. Thanks for watching. Huge shout out to James Pruitt, Raven Lambkin, Corey Matson, Reed, and Pythonian, who receive early access to these videos thanks to donations of $5 to $10 a month. Big thanks to James McGonigal, not to be confused with Minerva McGonigal, for allowing me to use his cello covers from the Dragon Age soundtrack for these videos. See you guys next time.